by a lack of information coming out of the CWCB. And so there were lots of questions that people wanted to ask, related to what a compact call might look like, different ways that could be sliced up across and within basins. And so that meaty stuff is still to come, but I hope to give you guys a little bit of a taste for where we've been so far in this presentation. And then finally, once we've sort of looked at those pieces across and within basins, we were also tasked with looking at revisiting the question of a quote-unquote water bank at Lake Powell. And in this case, we're talking, when we say water bank, we're really talking about a bank intended to protect the entire upper basin against bad things happening at Lake Powell, and that could be the loss of hydropower and the associated revenue, or it could be a compact deficit type situation. The one thing I would note on that is that we had originally intended to look at a 1 million acre foot bank, and that was in line with work that we had done previously back in phases 1 and 2. Given the language of the DCPs and that the 500,000 acre feet that was the set aside for Lake Powell as part of the DCP agreement, we decided that we would scale that back and stay in line with what the DCP had anticipated for our purposes. And again, we're not there yet, but that's coming in the near future in our order of work.
Well, John.
So, yep.
John Currier, and I might interject one comment here. We may, while the DCP docs are based on a 500,000 acre foot demand management pool, unequalized, non-equalized demand management pool, that's through 2026, and it's negotiable thereafter. I think we may want to also look back at the 1 million acre foot pool and compare the 500,000 acre foot pool to the 1 million acre foot pool and determine how much additional risk reduction you get with that bigger non-equalized pool.
Yeah, I agree. And I also, I haven't, John, I guess we haven't talked about the economic piece of this lately, but I know that there was, I know that the economic question has been raised, and there's, I believe, a project that's going to get started before too long looking at that question. I'm not sure if it's directly related to this, but I mean, I think that's a really important piece as well. Okay, well, so that's just a very quick recap on kind of what the big picture was with the scope of work. The items in red are really what we've been working on so far, and as John said, it's sort of a precursor to getting into the meat of the study, but for a variety of reasons, things have been moving a little bit slower than we had anticipated at the start of the project. But we have gotten some good input from the CWCD in January. I think they continue to loosen the screws, if you will, regarding information about the modeling that they did. And so we continue to nudge them, hopefully in that direction of releasing more information and understanding a bit more about what they were looking at. So in any case, so let me just talk through a little bit of, give you a little flavor for some of the results, very early results that we're seeing. And these are not necessarily the results to the key questions you guys were asking, but it's really an investigation into kind of the model behavior and what the model is showing with respect to different administration dates in the basin, and perhaps different yields as compared to what, at least what I would consider to be kind of conventional wisdom about how much water is consumed in Colorado. So one thing we wanted to do was we wanted to look at different, just look at different administration dates. And when I say administration dates here, the idea is that we're going to choose dates at which a call would occur in this linked model, and all of the water rights junior to that date are going to be 100% called out. Okay, so this, you could envision this In the case of a 1922 call, that would be a compact call, right? All the water junior to 22 is called out. But we identified several other dates that we wanted to look at as well, and those are shown here. Just kind of as a bookmark, the turn of the 20th century, or actually 19th century, I guess, depending on your perspective. But the signing of the Colorado River Compact, the signing of the Boulder Canyon Project Act, and of course, there's some discussion out there about which of those would really be a compact call date. And then the other two dates that we wanted to look at were really to bookmark the big Trans-Basin diversion projects. So July of 35 and July of 57, which are essentially one day before the CBT project authorization, and then the 57 date, which is one day after the Fryard project. And so we wanted we identified these 5 dates, and we wanted to look then at how much water would be available for consumption in the basin if all the rights junior to each of these dates were actually called out. The other question that we had relates to the way that state mod models the prior appropriation doctrine. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, it uses the admin dates that come out of, that are basically derived from the adjudication process. And so those admin dates are kind of accepted within the basin, or largely accepted within each sub-basin, within the AMPA, within the main stem, et cetera, as being, the correct sequence of administration within that basin. But in the linked model, all the basins are, of course, linked together. And so there was this question raised about, well, what about water rights that perhaps are administratively junior but appropriatively senior to other rights? What about water rights that maybe were not adjudicated until after the signing of the compact, but which in fact were appropriated for use and put to use before the compact? And so we wanted to look at that as well, and that's those are some of the results I'm just going to show you here real quick.
Hey, John, Dave Merritt, just one point. 1935 was the date of appropriation for CBT. The date of authorization was 1937.
Okay, I'll have to check on that.
Well,
Thank
it's
you.
administered as 8/1/1935.
Yeah, the water right was appropriated, but it was not the project was not authorized by federal legislation from 1937.
Okay, and I'll have to go
Yeah,
back. It may have been administered in I'm not sure what, is that the admin date in state mod as well?
The admin date's 8/1/1935, John.
Yeah.
You got that right.
Oh, it is, okay.
But it was authorized by Congress. Yeah,
Right,
administered, but yeah. You said authorization. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
Wrong wording, right date, John.
Right. So what this is showing, there's sort of two things of interest here in my mind. But what you're looking at is the amount of consumptive use within Colorado, in all the Colorado basins, Colorado River basins, that can utilize their water rights that are senior to that given either appropriation date or admin date. And so you see about, a little over 1 million or a little under 1 million acre feet of pre-1900 water, about 1.5 to 1.6 million acre feet of pre-compact. If you take 22 as the pre-compact water, there's really not much of a difference between that and the 1929 date. And then you see the 35 and the 57 dates. And most of the use, there's a little bit of post 57 water, but this is the average over the most recent 30 years in state mod. So you get an average consumption within Colorado of about 2.3 million acre feet of Colorado River water, and that includes, of course, all the Trans-Basin water and all the West Slope uses as modeled in the baseline state mod model, which is their best estimate of what current consumptive uses are, current demands are in the system me and that I was a little bit surprised by was the amount of pre-compact water that the model actually shows being available for consumptive use. And, in my mind, or at least when we look at historical data on usage, and look at how water rights were utilized, both pre and post compact water rights, they're in my mind, and I think others have, I've heard Eric Kuhn say this in the past, that roughly speaking, of the 2.2 or 2.3 million acre feet of consumptive use in the West, in Colorado River water, that roughly half of that was pre-compact and half of that was post-compact. And that may well be true in terms of the water rights that were actually being exercised. But interestingly, when push comes to shove, and in state mod, when we actually implement a compact call, and we get something closer to 1.5 or 1.6 million acre feet of pre-compact consumptive use, and that to me was an interesting outcome. And it took a while for me to fully appreciate why that was happening. But what we think is going on there, and having talked to Wilson Water and folks at the River District and other folks at the CRWCD, is that historically water usage was relatively inefficient with respect to pre-compact and post-compact water, and people were exercising different water rights at different times, and there wasn't necessarily always a lot of stress on the system. And that's reflected in the model, and it's reflected in the historical data. But when you actually put a compact call on the system and you have the ability to only use those pre-compact water rights, the efficiency goes up. And so, that increase in cropping efficiency, when you're only able to utilize the rights that are senior to the compact, results in actually a much higher percentage of that crop consumptive use being met by those pre-compact water rights. That to me was an interesting outcome. I think there's some other potentially interesting takeaways from that, one of which would be that the amount of the relative percentage of uses that are junior or would have to be junior to the compact perhaps isn't exactly 50 west slope, 50 east slope. It may be more like 75% east slope. And that was sort of an interesting follow-up outcome to what we've seen so far.
Is it efficiency or yield you're talking about?
Well,
what's that?
Let me add my 2 cents worth here. Is we have a lot of post-compact consumptive use, but we also have a lot of post-compact water rights that are basically supplemental water rights. And when push comes to shove, if you don't have that supplemental water right available to you, you're going to rely on your pre-compact water right. You may have less water in your ditch because you don't have that post-compact right, but you're gonna have to work harder to get across your land, but your consumptive use is gonna remain functionally the same. And so, this was a little bit of a surprising number, but when we talked through it with the CRWCD and Wilson Water Group, we're convinced that this is fairly right. And the key takeaway is that it really shifts the balance of the post-compact consumptive use more heavily to the TMDs, because the difference between that curtailing to pre-CBT to post-Fry Arc project, that's 600,000 acre feet. At least 500,000 of that acre feet is trans-mountain diversion water. And so I expect this to be an interesting topic of discussion as this discussion evolves.
And my question, John, this is Dave Merritt, is you say efficiency. Is it efficiency or is it yield? Does the water right, the pre-compact water right, yield more because there is more water available? to it. It's not that it's more efficient, but it just yields more.
No, because those pre-compact water rights would have had that same amount available to them all along. I mean, if it's a pre-compact right and it's being shorted, then it would have called out somebody that was junior to it in the model, absent some other, so it is definitely efficiency. It's not that it's not that their supply has increased by virtue of the call. It really is a change in the efficiency of those senior rights. At least that's the thinking, and that's what the CW, that's what Michelle at CRWCD is thinking it is, and that's also what Aaron Wilson is.
Okay, so the irrigators have changed to more efficient use of those water rights.
Well,
that's correct.
Changed too, and it goes back to, let's just say, if I was back in private practice and doing a water rights change case, and I was looking at the historic irrigation on 100 acres that was irrigated with a combination of pre-compact water rights and post-compact water rights, or senior and junior water rights, and it was determined from a water application rate that you could have met the consumptive requirements of the crop with the senior right, would have certainly have applied all of that, or concluded that all of that consumptive use was occurring under that senior water right as opposed to the junior water right. Certainly the junior water right helps the irrigator get across the land, but if he didn't have that junior water right, he would have gotten across the land and gotten that irrigated with the senior right. Bill would have been out there a few hours a day longer, but
yeah, but he'd be doing it.
he would have gotten it done. And so that's really where push comes to shove, is if you curtail all the post-compact rights, you're still going to get the consumptive use under the pre-compact rights.
Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, thank you, John. Proceed.
Yep. Well, so we, this really is just kind of gives you a flavor for some of the questions we've been asking of the model and making sure we understand the behavior of the model, and again, working with the CRWCD to make sure that we're understanding why it's behaving the way it's behaving, because what comes next in this study really is to look at those questions that you guys are particularly interested in, which is, if we curtail different basins, or if we have different levels of required water deliveries, over and above existing uses, if each basin contributes 20%, or if each basin contributes as a fraction of its consumptive use, or what have you, that we want to make sure we know what the model is doing, and fully understand that. So the next step, and one of the other things we have been working on and are I think coming close to closure on, is identifying a set of incremental future growth for both wet slope and transbasin diversion water uses that we can plug into the models. And I think going back to some of the work in phase 1 and phase 2, we looked at different demands and the impact of different levels of consumptive use on the risk profiles. And we want to do that again here. When we did that in phases 1 and 2, we really assumed just a blanket percentage. As you may recall, we increased the consumptive use or decreased consumptive use by certain percentages. We looked at different demand schedules from the basin study. This time around, we wanted to be a little bit more specific and identify some, I guess what I would call some of the larger potential future components of growth within the basins. And so, first things first, an important caveat right there at the top. These numbers that we're coming up with are not intended to either represent all possible future uses, and they're certainly not intended to exclude from consideration any possible future uses. We really just wanted to identify a few big projects in each basin that are significant in their volumes, and perhaps likely to occur over the next couple decades. So we're not looking at 200 years or 100 years. We really wanted to try to narrow this down. So we're getting close on this. And we can talk through the details of each of these, but you can see basin by basin what the numbers are that we have arrived at. For the Yampa and the Upper Colorado and the Gunnison, those are all driven by the existing programmatic biological opinion numbers. So, we decided that we would use the PBOs as the threshold for additional growth in those basins. And then for the White and the Southwest, we needed to come up with something, because those basins don't have PBOs, we wanted to come up with something that was reasonable for those two basins. Taken as a whole, the numbers that we've arrived at total about a little less than 350,000 acre feet of additional depletions. That's about a 15% increase over current usage. Let's see here, whoops. Let me just go into a little bit more detail about where each of these come from.
Especially the White. That's speculative.
Yeah. That has to be some energy.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'll just run through these fairly quickly. The Yampa PBO within the PBO, I think, allows for an additional, or exactly the number, 57,000 or something like that. But part of that is for the Little Snake. So within Colorado, the PBO allows another 30,000 roughly. The Yampa Roundtable, and in some of the modeling that was done for them by Wilson, they identified and had modeled three new projects that total about 22,000 acre feet. And in addition to that, we have about the remainder of that is coming from increased consumptive use from ag. Again, that's from the Yampa PBO. On the White, that 65,000 is largely from the energy needs assessment. I think the median, there was 3 different volumes identified from the needs assessment. I think the median number or the medium number from the needs assessment was something like, I think it was actually 64 or 50. I can't remember what exactly the number was, but this 65 is pretty close to that. It turns out that there's, I think the number we arrived at was actually about 59 for energy and another 6 for M&I that would be associated with the growth around the energy industry. So anyway, that's where the 65 comes from for the White. And John, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, no, I think that covered it. That was basically using the number from the phase 2 energy study that basically downscaled the future depletions in the White to this potential energy number. And it's really, this was kind of thermal power plant cooling ultimately was what it came to.
And then on the Colorado main stem, the PBO there is 120,000. We, after talking, John and Mark Hermanstein talked quite a bit about this, but arrived at the numbers that are shown here. 85,000 acre feet of additional utilization of existing infrastructure, existing TBDs. So the kind of the big 4 that you see there, Moffett, Blue, Homestake, and Windy Gap. Plus 35,000 acre feet of additional West Slope main stem Colorado uses. On the Gunnison, the PBO is pretty well defined in terms of what projects are covered. Additional use for Dallas Creek, the Upper Gunnison subordination, which we probably will just model as being entirely or certainly largely agricultural consumptive use. And then about 3,500 miscellaneous consumptive use. Again, and will show up on the North Fork. So those three covers a 37.9 on the Gunnison, and then for the Southwest, we actually went back and forth on this a little bit more than the others, but arrived at a number of about 90,000 acre feet. And you can see the breakout below, 30,000 of new Animas La Plata. The San Miguel project, which originally was identified as 85,000, but we've cut that back by 75% here and are using a little over 21,000 for that. And then 15,000 for tribal water. And the tribal water piece was interesting. I mean, I think there's, we may want to revisit this down the road. I think you're all well aware that the tribal study, Reclamation's tribal needs study was released just in the last few months. And the tribal study actually identifies 115,000 acre feet of consumptive use in the Southwest district within the state of Colorado. So, you know, I think we were hesitant to put that entire number in there for a variety of reasons. So we're going to use 15 as the starting point, but you know, I think there may be a desire down the road. I know Southwest has expressed a desire down the road to actually see what that full use might look like if, in fact, the tribal water was fully bought online. And then there are a few miscellaneous other projects. One of the challenging pieces for the Southwest is that both in reality and in the model, you know, there's a bunch of little basins that are not really connected within the state of Colorado. They all flow out of the state individually. And so we've identified some other smaller consumptive uses, increases in some of those smaller subbasins as well, with the help of Bruce Whitehead and Carrie Padgett. So we have all those future demands. I think we're ready to move forward, and the next step then is to plug those demands into state mod and into CRSS, and then we're going to start running both baseline or current conditions modeling scenarios and these future condition scenarios, and start looking at those meaty questions that we mentioned before. So, for example, if there was a compact deficit, or if you know, we were trying to fill a compact bank in Lake Powell, what are the different mechanisms, or what are the different distributions of that water, if you will, that we might want to employ to get there? So, looking at pro rata volumes by subbasin, the idea of pro rata volumes between in-basin uses and trans-basin uses, the likely yield of certain volumes by different admin dates. In other words, what would it look like if there was not a compact call back to 1922, but a call of some sort or an administration of some sort that only went back to 1940, let's say? You know, what would that look like? So these are all questions that the various roundtables have been asking, and that we've been compiling. And so that's really kind of next on our agenda, is to dig into this stuff. And like I say, and like John mentioned, that, you know, that was really the meat of the original scope. But as we got into it, we realized there was a lot of work that needed to be done up front to better understand the model, to make sure that the model that the state had given us was doing what we thought it was doing, or doing it the way we thought it should be doing it. So that's what's coming next. And then down the road, we intend to have meetings with each of the roundtables. Guessing that's going to be sometime in the April timeframe. I think that last item there, the West Slope, the 4 West Slope Basin meeting, I think that actually, John, if I read your email correctly, has now been scheduled for sometime in May. Is that correct?
May 2nd.
Okay, May 2nd. So there you go. So that's what's next, and that's a short overview of where we are and where we're headed. I'll stop there.
I just want to add one additional piece related to the future development scenarios. You know, really, it phases 1 and 2, we used increasingly just ratcheting up demand schedules from, the basin study. And what we wanted to do in this was to make a stark comparison between the risk profile at PAL with the DCP and without the DCP, based on what our existing upper basin depletions are. Then we wanted to do the same thing with this future depletion amount. How much does the risk increase at PAL if we deplete these future amounts in the basin? And so while the phases 1 and 2 were kind of nuanced with the increasing, just ever increasing rates, this was more intended to be a more stark comparison between risk today and risk with some future development. And I will say one thing that's being built into this is, John quantified that, hey, this is basically a 15% increase in Colorado river depletions in Colorado. We're basically applying that same 15% depletion increase to the other upper basin states at the same time, saying, okay, so really, if Colorado's roughly half of the upper basin depletions, we provide some allowance for other development in the other upper basin states as well. So that 300 and some odd thousand acre feet that we quantified here turns into more like 600,000 acre feet across the whole upper basin.
At what point do we stop over deliveries to the lower basin?
We're legally allowed to.
Well,
at what point do we stop assuming? 2026?
Well, right now we're operating this under we'll be operating this under the yet to be officially approved drought contingency.
So we'll
Dave, that's one of the scenarios I would like to look at as we head down the road here. And we've done this before for you guys. It's been quite a few years, but we have asked that question, and we have actually we have the model set up in a way, and the model can be run such that after 2026 we actually revert back to the LROC.
Good.
And I think that's something that I think that's one variation on future operations that would be worth looking at.
Thank you. Yes,
and
really
that certainly is something that the CRWCD and the UCRC have actively been looking at, and I've been I've done that model run for them as well. So
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Alden had a question. Yeah.
One of the I'm just going back to the future depletions. Is there anything within that thought process on how quickly some of these future depletions can be developed?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about what the time frame of this is, but at the end of the day, it wasn't really tied to a time frame.
Okay.
So we didn't say, oh gosh,
Yeah.
we expect 20,000 acre feet in the Southwest to come online in the next 10 years, and another 20,000 in the following years.
I don't think I clarified my question well enough. 'Cause I think we're talking two separate things here. Say market drives the increase. How quickly market will develop that water to be used in the basin. Because that's, if we want to do something for fish flows, that's going to take some period of time. But if the market drives the water to be developed, that's going to happen fairly quickly, especially with these water rights already sitting there. Is that something that should be included within or of consideration? I don't know.
So that's an interesting question. I think, and it certainly isn't something that we've been thinking about. I mean, the way I've been thinking about this is, the conditions in the basin right now are such that the consumptive use has been pretty. I mean, there's annual variability certainly. I mean, there's up years and down years in terms of consumption. But if you look at the last roughly 20 years, the consumption has been pretty flat. And so in my mind, one piece of this puzzle is, here we are today. If we assume that over the near term that consumption remains relatively flat, what do these different options look like? I mean, if we don't get, if Powell continues to drop, if meat continues to drop, if we, God forbid, get into a situation where there's a compact deficit, what are the different options, sort of where we sit today? And then the second piece, which is this growth piece, this future conditions piece, in my mind is almost as much it sort of poses a policy question and as much as a sort of how do we deal with the problem type of question. And the policy side of that obviously is, should we, if economic drivers dictated, if, however it comes to fruition, if that much growth did happen, what impact does that have on the existing uses in terms of increasing the risk to all of the existing uses? And we can speculate about which basin and where and when and all that stuff. And I think that's completely intangible, and there's no way to get at that. But so when I think about it, I like to just think, broadly speaking, as a policy question about growth, or if we're going to have this much growth, what other things do we need to do to protect ourselves? A much broader conversation than the specifics of where we are today and how would a demand management program or how would a compact call be administered today. So for me personally, I kind of like to split it that way.
Yeah. So we weren't really getting into, okay, gosh, something happens in the basin and it takes, there's new water development right now. We haven't really split that out or tried to parse out how that might happen, because we simply don't know to any way, shape, or form how that might happen.
But that's a real variable, though.
It's a real variable, and it certainly, if there was 10,000 acre feet of new energy-related depletions 3 years from now in the White, would that certainly impact a curtailment kind of scenario? Yeah, absolutely. But we haven't tried to run it in that many increments.
I understand. It gets rather complicated, very complicated.
So I guess a couple, are the conditional water rights included in here too? The ones that haven't been developed, that are still part of the depletions? And then my second part, my second part of the question is that, so again, we're talking about future uses and using the PBOs to quantify them, and yet we're still tying that back into a 1922 compact call, and I guess there's huge area in between those two things that I'm confused about.
Yeah, so number one, the baseline model, the state mod model, has what is its best estimate of current uses. And so any water rights that are not currently being used, so conditional rights, even the tribal rights in the Southwest, none of that is turned on. There is no current consumption of that water in the model right now, in that baseline version. To your question about these future uses and the compact, part of the puzzle is, if we put those future uses in, there is, it's not just about those uses getting called out. It's also about the frequency with which Lake Powell might get into a compact deficit situation. So, we could have many years. You can have 10 years of water use in the upper basin at an increased level, at an extra 700,000 acre feet a year in the entire upper basin, and that amounts to 7 million acre feet over 10 years. And so that use could go on for quite some time before you actually run into a compact deficit type problem. But the question much more frequently is that problem going to happen? You know, how much sooner and how much deeper and how much more frequently is it likely that additional growth would then send us down a path where we would have a compact deficit or a bigger compact deficit than we would have had that growth not occurred. And so that's kind of the direction that we go with that future use.
Mr. Albee.
So, will you be able to get more detail on the 1.5 to 1.6 pre-compact number? Is that something you're going to keep looking at? Or are we pretty certain of that number now? Or,
well,
I mean, that's a huge
number,
new piece of information.
Yeah. And it was somewhat surprising to me. I mean, I wasn't really expecting it. And you know, we thought that perhaps we were doing something wrong in the model, and we went and talked to Michelle and others, and they said, no, we think that's actually what's going on, which in my mind means that that's the same result that they saw when they were doing the compact compliance work. You know, in other words, they looked at this same question and said, hey, you know, historic usage data aside, which shows kind of a roughly 50-50 split, if push comes to shove, there really is enough water, and if we assume the efficiencies can increase that much, you know, that you could actually have 1.6 million acre feet of pre-compact consumptive use. So, I mean, I think we want to keep looking at it and keep talking about it with the state. I don't know that we're going to, I think it would be worthwhile going back and revisiting just how much, what the cap is they put on increased efficiency. I mean, did they bump it? Did they allow it to go up to, 75% or 80%? I don't know. But I think those are all questions worth asking.
Well, there's also another reason that may come into play why this is 1.6 instead of 1.2. Early on, when these numbers were being quantified in the basin by Blaney and Criddle using their model, they came up with roughly the 1.1 to 1.2 million acre feet as far back as 1948. And the methodologies for estimating consumptive use have improved dramatically since then. And so, what the state uses is a modified Blaney-Criddle, which uses some high elevation turf grass coefficients, and then it uses various temperature adjustment coefficients lower in the basin, which has increased that overall consumptive use.
But they haven't gone to Penn-Monteith yet.
But these numbers are starting to fairly closely match what you come up using a more sophisticated model that they're referring to, the Penn-Monteith. So part of this is improvement. It's not just simply being more efficient with your consumptive use, your senior water rights. It's also partially the methodology in which it's determined.
And higher degree of accuracy. And I was going to make that. Thank you, John. I was going to raise that issue.
But
also point out that explanation, in theory, could be more advantageous to the state from Colorado and the West Slope than the other explanation.
Well, if we're talking about demand management being based on post-compact uses, which is one scenario that we sort of thought it was going to be based on, if it turns out that 3/4 of that is actually front range, that's a rather huge new piece of information.
I'm sure everyone will roll with that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking is they're going to accept this immediately, right?
That's what they alluded to, that this was going to be a topic of discussion.
And just so you know, the discussion that John Karen and John Courier had, I was on the phone as well with the CRWCD folks, modelers there and their contract modelers. Front range modelers were on the phone listening to this very point, and didn't necessarily say they agreed, but they heard it, know where it's headed.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
I would just add one more thing to the conversation, and thank you for bringing up the issue of consumptive use, those crop irrigation consumptive use numbers. And, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. I would just remind people as well that reclamation right now is in the process of doing a very comprehensive basin-wide review of all of those numbers, and that, you know, I'm not sure what Jim Prairie's schedule is for getting results out of that, but that's something that may change some of this as well. But there is sort of a flip side to that issue, however, which is that, and as you know, as a hydrologist, I tend to geek out on these things. But one interesting consequence of having significantly higher historical consumptive use than we may have been estimating is that changes the entire dynamic of basin hydrology.
Yep.
In other words, we know how much water went downstream. We estimated how much water got consumed. If in fact a lot more water was being consumed, then that bumps the entire historical hydrologic record upwards. In other words, there was more water that fell than we anticipated. So, you know, there's lots of other implications with that as well.
Yeah, there's all sorts of complexities involved in that. We've been trying to deal with it for a number of years. How do you go back and change that record?
That's why Jim Prairie's natural flow database is never the same.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all I have. Any other questions?
That's all, folks.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John. Yep.
All right.
Looking forward to the next installment.
Okay.
What is the
Yep.
timeline for this report to be completed?
Well,
Sorry.
we're hoping that most of the substantive work is done by the end of March. We should be reporting out to most of the basin roundtables in the second half of March, with the more complete report out to the 4 basin roundtable meeting on May 2nd. I think what the results are likely to spawn additional questions and potential different modeling runs, but the vast majority of the work that's scoped should be done by the end of March.
So our April board meeting, we would have some good presentations.
I was actually thinking April in my mind, so.
Yeah, good, yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mr. Karen.
Thank you, John. Yep.
All right. Well, before we adjourn, I did one last thing. Wanted to thank Denise Hussein for many years of awesome service. Today is actually her last day of employment here at the River District. She is retiring, and just want to everybody congratulate her and thank her for her.
I wondered why she was smiling at me.
That's what she's smiling. It's that's them.
Margaritas at 5.
What a way to spend your life.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you very much.
Travel